Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Democratic Constitution podcast. I'm really excited today to be talking with David Waldstreicher, and we're going to talk with David about many things, but revolving around his book, Slavery's Constitution. So, David, thanks so much for joining us. I was hoping you could introduce yourself and also include what led you to write your book, Slavery's Constitution.
Sure. It's great to be here. I'm David Waldstreicher. I teach history at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. I used to teach it before that at Temple University and University of Notre Dame and Yale University and Bennington College. I'm a historian of American political culture, usually writing about the Revolutionary era and the early Republic, and about slavery and anti-slavery. And after I wrote a book about Benjamin Franklin and slavery, which came out in 2004, I noticed that in looking at that episode at the very end of Franklin's life, when he is simultaneously elected president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society and a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, and those roles began to tug in different directions, and he declined to present the PAS's anti-slavery petition to the convention, that there had been very little written about that, and in fact that the literature on slavery and the founding was not as extensive as one might have expected. Also, when I was teaching at Notre Dame and preparing a course on the Revolutionary era, one of the things I did in order to prepare was start reading in Bernard Bailyn's 2-volume Library of America edition of the debates on the Constitution, which was published for the bicentennial of the Constitution in the late 80s, I think, but which I hadn't really read. And what I hadn't quite realized was how much that very good edition, which intersperses things like the Federalist Papers and the records of the convention with pieces that appeared in newspapers and some of the better known pro and con essays about the Constitution that were written and published during the ratification debates, that there was more commentary about slavery and the role of slavery in the United States and the effects that the Constitution might or might not have on slavery in the debates over ratification than the existing literature on ratification or on the whole creation of the Constitution would have one believe. And I got interested in that, and I knew that there was more in those documents and in the press than one might think, because I had looked at those materials when researching my first book, which was about nationalism and popular politics during and after the revolution. So I knew that the ratification debates were more contentious than most people know or most historians had said. But I really wasn't prepared for just how much there was there on slavery. So between the question of slavery and the founders and Franklin, who more and more had a reputation for being anti-slavery, that I or being one of, if not the anti-slavery founding fathers, in which I wanted to complicate. Between that and the question of the ratification debates, I thought, okay, there's a before, during, and after story here about slavery and the making of the Constitution that really has never been written, and certainly never presented in a concise way that could be useful in the classroom. So I decided I would write a short book, and that would be about slavery and the Revolution, slavery and the Constitutional Convention, slavery and the ratification debates, and try to make sense of the bigger picture. So that's how I came to write this little book, which is called Slavery's Constitution, From Revolution to Ratification. And I'll just say one more thing about the title, which is sometimes construed in a kind of single-minded way, as if I'm saying that the Constitution is just 100% pro-slavery, and so it was slavery's Constitution. I am saying that on balance, the Constitution went in a pro-slavery direction, but I really meant the title as a kind of double entendre, that what we're dealing with here is the aspects of the Constitution that were in debt to slavery and dealt with slavery, and the way that slavery became constitutionalized and was always part of the constitutional order afterward. That way that slavery becomes weaved into, hardwired into the rules of governance was really what I was most after and what I most wanted to convey in the story, because I felt that hadn't been emphasized enough, and that it's a kind of complicated, sometimes subtle matter, that saying that the founders wanted to preserve slavery and they made sure that happened doesn't quite do justice to the way that they did it in a very indirect and even quiet kind of way that gave many of them cover. And another way of putting it is they got to have their anti-slavery feelings while having their pro-slavery policies, which is my spin on the question of compromise, which is the way it's usually talked about.
Absolutely. Well, I think we'll get into both of those things you mentioned. One, lack of writing or a need to say something about this topic, which was what drove you to write the book, it sounds like. And then how the Constitution maybe created a framework through which slavery could be preserved. Because as we'll get into, you don't see the word slave or slavery in the document. So it appears in certain ways. But your book provides context for the Constitutional Convention of 1787. We don't just start with the convention because, of course, the people there are bringing ideas and history with them around slavery. So I was hoping that you could sort of set the scene for us for the convention of 1787 and say what was the state of slavery in this newly independent U.S. What had the Articles of Confederation set out? There were all these different state constitutions. What was the scene?
Okay, if we're going to focus on the 1780s, though I begin rather earlier, I think the story really begins with the way that the issue of slavery comes up in the imperial controversy already,
Sure.
even in the early 1760s. But and that had I'll shorthand that. What happened before 1775 was a process by which slavery got mixed up in the issues of who's in charge, who makes the rules in the empire, who makes law, when can Parliament strike down laws, as they uh, struck down efforts to regulate the slave trade on some occasions, but also, especially, it became especially clear after the Somerset case in 1772, might decide to say free slaves who were taken from the colonies to London from being kidnapped and put back on a ship, as Charles Stewart, the colonial official, had done with James Somerset. So things seem to be moving in both directions. On the one hand, the colonists are insisting on their right to make their own laws, especially where it concerns their property, which includes enslaved people. On the other hand, Parliament, or the courts, in the case of the Somerset case, are also insisting on their ability to trump those laws when they want to. So it's not as if there had not been controversies over these things before, but they become very heated, and it becomes very much matters of what is the constitution of the empire? What are the rules? What are the rights of what are the rights and expectations of Parliament, of the King, of courts in England versus those of, say, governors in the colonies who have to do what theoretically and practically have to do what they're told by the Board of Trade or by the ministry, and the elected colonial assemblies, or even the courts in the colonies. So the issue of slavery is a political issue, and even though there aren't very many people who are taking the issue deliberately to the courts in order to set precedents, you are starting to see anti-slavery activists do things like that, and that's actually what results in Somerset's case. But given that. the issues of taxation and representation and the rights of colonists are really coming to a head in the cities, and especially in Boston. On the one hand, we see some anti-slavery, some folks saying we are against oppression, and the British ministry is trying to enslave us. They're taking away their rights. They're sending troops over here. They're threatening our property, and we're against all that. And we're for the rights of Englishmen, and maybe even for natural rights. And so, this is sending some people in a direction of saying that slavery is wrong too, and we're not for that. On the other hand, it's also, but that is offensive to some people for whom the right to hold slaves is more significant. So it's becoming controversial. It's becoming politicized. It is also and I can't emphasize this enough because it doesn't get emphasized enough in the literature, and I've been arguing this for 20 years. It's getting thrown in their faces by Tories, by people in England who are critical of the resistance movements, and they're saying these people are a bunch of hypocrites. They're talking about their liberties, but they are the biggest oppressors in the Anglo world. Look at the way they are slaveholders. Look at the way they treat their slaves. So it's all becoming very dicey. And this is important, especially because some historians like Gordon Wood continue to say, well, the slavery wasn't much of an issue because look, people like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson don't talk about it all the time, and they don't talk about it in their pamphlets. Well, they've got a real incentive not to talk about it because it's becoming more and more embarrassing. And there's more and more of a disparity between the things they will say in their letters and the things they will say in public. And that's the situation when you get to 1775, and suddenly it's a war, and the question is, there's a potential fifth column. Slaves might get liberated, they might fight on either side, and in fact they end up fighting on both sides. The first move, though, is by Lord Dunmore and by the British to offer liberty to slaves who fight with the Loyalists or fight with Governor Dunmore in Virginia, and that helps push some Southerners in places like Virginia and South Carolina toward the Patriots, as Woody Holton has argued. But then there are moves in the other direction where some Africans from the beginning are fighting in New England with the Patriots. Others are using the wartime situation to flee. And this is what happens during wartime in slave societies especially, but even in societies with fewer slaves. War both liberates slaves, and it also becomes a way to enslave more people, or to resets the rules, as it were. And so during wartime, both because of the ideological pressures and because of the fact that it's a civil war, things go in both directions. Slaves get liberated, but also because the Patriots win, their property in slaves are confirmed, and the government's insistence on the new state governments insist on protecting it. And in fact, in places that, especially in South Carolina and Georgia, they start importing slaves again to make up for the thousands who have fled. So it's in the 1780s. You have the situation where slavery has been, to some extent, undermined ideologically and practically in terms of tens of thousands of people getting liberated. On the other hand, the states have been empowered to do what they want, which means that some of the northern ones start to try to be consistent and move in an anti-slavery direction. Pennsylvania, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Massachusetts in an ambiguous way by the mid-1780s. Not in New York, but there's talk about doing it. In the North, things seem to be moving in an anti-slavery direction. They loosen the manumission laws in Virginia, but things are definitely going in the other direction further south. The Articles of Confederation actually makes it easier to recapture slaves who flee across state lines because of the comity provisions and the guarantees to property. On the other hand, it empowers the states to go do what they want, including reopening the slave trade. So the movement in the Articles government toward the states having more power than they had in the empire to run their own affairs, or as some of the settlers think, reset things to the way they used to be actually makes slavery potentially more controversial because it hasn't been resolved in any kind of a national way. And the trends are going in both directions toward securing slave property and making it easier to pass laws that might end the slave trade or end slavery itself. And that both those trends are going on. And that's the situation that the Constitutional Convention is faced with in 1787.
There are many interesting things in what you said. Two of them stand out. One, these arguments of hypocrisy that are being leveled against some of the colonists around desiring independence or liberty while facilitating being involved in the slave trade. The other, how the role of slavery is presented in a lot of the colonial era history and how important historians see that. But let's follow the conversation into the Constitutional Convention. You did a nice job, leading us to that point. What are some of the debates that are taking place during the convention? What are arguments that different sides are making?
Well, I think the most important thing is that they don't go, the delegates don't arrive in Philadelphia consciously saying, we're going to have to negotiate over slavery, we're going to have to decide on its future. What does happen, and you can see intimations of this in the Continental Congress when they're making their own rules for how they're going to vote and when they're the long process of fashioning the Articles of Confederation government, is that the central issues of creating a federal government, of representation, taxation, and sovereignty cannot be resolved without dealing with slavery, and in fact do get resolved by dealing with slavery. And that takes weeks and weeks and weeks and leads to a kind of intricate situation where they have had to deal with the way in which these questions arose and couldn't be separated from the other key issues, such as how are we going to vote in the national legislature going to have one branch or two? Are they going to have different functions, the House of Representatives and the Senate? What's going to be the role of the executive versus the legislative branch? Who's going to have the power to tax? How is that power going to be decided? What kinds of taxation are going to be allowed? Why do these things have anything to do with slavery? Not only is there a question of what can be taxed, how are you going to decide how the federal government is going to be supported? Or what kinds of taxation are allowed for other public policy purposes? Should taxation be based on population? If there's a national tax, should it be based on population or should it be based on wealth? Well, they tried wealth through land, but land prices were very volatile, especially during wartime, and that just didn't work. And that's one of the reasons why the economy was difficult to the currency and the economy was very difficult to control in the 1780s because of inflation, and the value of land was so unpredictable. So how can you tax when you don't know what the value of what you're taxing? So then so if you're going to tax people, because if labor really represents wealth, do slaves count? And what do you do with the fact that in some places there are a lot more slaves than in others? So, and then you have the problem of, okay, if you're apportioning a state legislature and you're saying, okay, Virginia is the biggest state and it gets like 12 representatives, and Connecticut's really small and they only get 4, is the population of slaves going to count even though they're not being represented? And this is the hottest button issue of all, because the whole question has been, we're not being represented. The whole complaint in the British Empire is, our legislatures are having less and less power. We're not really represented in Parliament, so we're going to go in this more democratic direction. Really, we're going to be a real republic, and our representatives are going to have to serve the interests of the people, meaning the citizens. But the citizens are really conceived of as being not just the people who can vote, but really them standing in for all the citizens. But even in that group that includes women and children, do enslaved people count as part of the people? And it's very tricky, because if they do count, that has implications, and if they don't count, that has implications. And the problem, the really difficult thing, is that in the South, they want slaves to count for representation because then they have more power in Congress, but they don't want them to count for taxation because they don't have to pay more taxes, and vice versa in the North. So you can't even separate, because of slavery, you can't even separate representation and taxation. What are the two biggest issues of the American Revolution? We shouldn't be taxed without being represented. So they just can't, when they're trying to figure out how to manage all this stuff about representation and taxation, in forming in the first article of the Constitution is all about Congress. It's the longest article. Easy to forget today, because we have a government today where Congress defers to the president and seems to think the president should set the legislative agenda and the president is the most powerful branch. That's not the case in the actual Constitution. Very consciously, it was all about the legislature, and they got around to dealing with the executive branch and the judicial branch after that, because that wasn't nearly as important in solving the problem of parliamentary tyranny and representation in the Republic. So they spend most of their time working out this problem of how to deal with slavery and what the rules would be, but without it really being about, wanting it to be about, how it would affect the future of slavery. But everyone knows it's going to affect the future of slavery, because if you create a representation incentive for states to have slaves, they're going to want to import more of them. But if you tax slaves, maybe not so much. So there's that problem, and then there's the problem of the rules of whether, and eventually, as part of the compromises over these issues, they end up dealing with the recapture of fugitive slaves in the Constitution, where they say yes, you can do that. They end up dealing with whether it's okay to import slaves or tax that importation. They say yes, you can import slaves, but only for 20 more years, and yes, the Congress can pass a tax, but only $10 per enslaved person. So it ends up being wrapped up in all these compromises without actually mentioning the word. And as part of this process happens, and they start to realize that the issues are bound up together, what you get is, in the Constitutional Convention, is more and more overt pro-slavery and anti-slavery statements. And this is all happening behind closed doors, so they feel they can be relatively frank about it, the delegates. You get people making pro-slavery and anti-slavery speeches that are partly about whether they think slavery should end, whether they understand the revolution should end slavery, or we don't want to have that here, or we want to discourage it, or was part of the point of the revolution was to protect all our property. You start to get more and more overt statements on one side or the other, as well as proposals to compromise them, in the process serving these ends of what is the fate of small states going to be if you have representation based on population. Oh, okay, we'll solve that by having a Senate where it's one vote per state, or two delegates per state. Well, but that's not fair to the big states, and those big states with a lot of population thus might get outvoted on things that matter a lot to them, such as things that might affect the plantation economy, especially. Okay, so we'll have it so that all bills for taxation have to go through the House of Representatives first. So the big states and the eastern states, they want economy to be able to be the imports and exports. They want to be able to do something about that, have a national economic policy. It's really, really important. They haven't had one, and they're getting taken advantage of. But the deal that's made says it has to come out of the House of Representatives, where the slave states will have extra representation because of the 3/5 clause, where their slaves get represented. And also, and the Committee on Detail puts in this nice little extra thing where they say exports can't be taxed. Right? Who cares about exports being taxed? The agricultural states, the people who are sending eventually cotton, but at that time indigo and rice and tobacco, especially, and that's their main crop. So they put in safeguards. There can be a national tax, but it has to come out of the House of Representatives, not out of the Senate. So there are all these intricate ways in which slavery is being protected from the national governments being empowered, but slavery is being protected from these very political powers that the national government is being given. And meanwhile, there are these protections from the smaller states, like Connecticut, for example, but also some of the newer states that are going to come in, so that their interests won't be will can still they'll still have this power in the Senate. So it's very complicated. And what I try to do is I try to tell it as a story to illustrate, because if you don't see it emerging and you don't see these arguments in the context of all the things they're dealing with, it's not it starts to we start to think that, oh, slavery, that's like a we think of it the way the abolitionists think of it, and the way the secessionists think about it, like it's kind of like a one issue thing. People who care about slavery, it's like we think of it as like it's a moral issue. It's like abortion. Like people who care about that, they only care about that, and that's the most important thing to that, and that's how they vote, and that's what they insist on. But that's not the case. It's an issue of power. It's an issue of the economy. So people are aware of their constituents' interests, and they're protecting and dealing with all these other powers at the same time that they're more and more aware that the issue of slavery is going to be a matter of public debate, and people can see the connection between slavery and all the other issues coming out of the revolution, and all the issues coming out of the economic downturn of the 1780s, and all the issues of federalism, ultimately, where the states want the protection of a national government, but they don't want to give up power to determine their economic future. They don't want to give up power to determine their police powers, and so there are all these these issues that are going to play out in the ratification debates and in the rest of American history.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. And as you point out, all of this goes on without the word slave or slavery being formally recognized in the document. And I think folks will be relatively familiar with how the Constitution more overtly perhaps protects slavery. I hesitate to delineate between overt and covert ways, but you have, what becomes known as the Fugitive Slave Clause, though of course it's not called the Fugitive Slave Clause in the document. You mentioned the the three-fifths representation clause. So enslaved people count as three-fifths of a person for representation purposes, but obviously can't vote. And then just as you were describing that, it made me think about one of the main issues, as I understand it, that comes up, one of several issues that comes up during Reconstruction, where, okay, if you remove the three-fifths clause, if slavery is no longer a thing, you now increase the population of these former slave states. But if you don't give these newly freed folks the right to vote, then all of these people are going to count to increase the representation for the former slave states. And so all of these things build on each other. And it's that question of representation, because then representation feeds into the House, feeds into the Senate, though in different ways, because the Senate always stays at two senators per state. And it connects into the Electoral College, how the president is elected, the Senate plays a role in electing the Supreme Court, so on and so forth. Just to tease out, how these things are all connected. I was reading, how other historians have described this period, and for example, Stott and Lind, who was someone who wrote a lot about this, describes, and probably not the only person to describe the Constitution as a compromise. A compromise, as Lind says, between Northern capitalists and Southern plantation owners. Do you find it helpful to think of the Constitution as a compromise between Northern Southern interests? Some people will say big states and small states, slave states and non-slave states. How do you think about that?
I think it's helpful, but maybe not sufficient to explain some of the aspects and the things that happen and how they happen uh, in the ratification debates and later on. Delegates talk about it being a compromise. Some of them will defend what happens as a compromise during ratification and then in the future. So that when Lind introduced the notion of a compromise of 1787, he was very wisely putting this moment in the tradition of American politics leading up to the Civil War, where there are a number of great compromises. And maybe, like, so we know that the Missouri Compromise, Compromise of 1850, the one that didn't happen in 1860 and 61, that was proposed, that would have changed the constitutional order, would have guaranteed the future of slavery for forever, to avert the Civil War. So I think it's really useful to think of this as a really constitutive and shaping compromise that sets up the later ones, and that makes it clear that slavery is an important aspect of national politics, and an aspect of the way the rules of federalism and national power and class conflict and political economy get played out in the first century of American history. One of the limits of it, though, besides the question of how overt the compromise was, the way Lind lays it out, and he's the first to acknowledge that the evidence is a little, is, you know, a couple people said that it was actually delegates going between Philadelphia and New York, where they were working out the Northwest Ordinance, and the government was actually still meeting the the Articles of Confederation government. Is that not only is it when we think about those later compromises, I mean, they are long processes that happen very publicly in Congress. This compromise, if it happened, is behind closed doors and not really overt and talked about. I think for me, it was a little bit too narrow and inside baseball to explain the nature of how we end up where we end up. For that, I think the public debates of the Revolutionary era around slavery, then getting narrowed and funneled into these closed door debates, and then opening up again and being talked through and argued through during the ratification debates, are really important. And the notion of compromise is just a little bit too neat. I mean, compromises, obviously, even those later compromises were very complicated and intricate in their own ways legislatively, and you can certainly they've been well analyzed as processes that took a year or two. In the case of the Missouri Compromise, like now we speak of the Missouri Compromise of 1819 to 21, like there are two of them. Really, there's a second Missouri Compromise over, like, when Missouri brings back its constitution, and they say free black people aren't going to be allowed in Missouri, and that leads to a whole, whether Congress is going to ratify their new constitution, because they basically said that free blacks aren't citizens, and that leads to a second compromise, over that Henry Clay has to broker. It's a very long, intricate process. The way that Lind talked about it, and like the kind of the sort of smoking gun that he found, I think it played into an excessive focus on the convention. That even as for 2 decades historians tried to argue against him, they did so by saying, well, Madison never really admitted it. It was only something that somebody said, that Madison said to him, that Edward Coles, Madison's secretary, said to somebody years later, that was how it happened, and Madison never really said it, and we don't really have there isn't enough evidence, and what about this, what about that? And it kind of made it all about the founders in ways that I was trying to say, this tendency to say what were the founders' intentions and what did they say about things explicitly is not adequate to understanding this political process, which is a much more public phenomenon than historians who want to focus on the founders and their ideas would have you believe, would have led us to think. So that's where I kind of try to kind of build on Lind, and while I'm definitely on his side in terms of most of the big issues about what the effects were, and that the compromise was ultimately had tragic pro-slavery effects, though not all of them intended.
Talking about public conversations and sort of moving the discussion beyond just what happened within those closed rooms, I think transitions nice into the next question I had. And more or less the next section of your book, which is to say, well, what was the ratification process like? And I don't know if there's been this is sort of a parenthetical, I don't know if there's an increase in interest among historians, I don't know, within the last 10 years or so around the, excuse me, the ratification debates. I just know that I've seen a few more books about that, and we've talked with Michael Klarman, for example, on the podcast before. Michael has his book, The Framers' Coup, talking about that event. There's so much to say about what was the ratification process like. So you talk about the ratification process through that lens of the slavery question, and I pulled out a little section of your book. You write that, and here I quote you: critics of the Constitution quickly perceived the compromises of 1787. Somewhat more gradually, they developed ideas about what those compromises indicated about the rest of the framers' design. As anti-slavery became a significant, if not ubiquitous, theme in the debate over the Constitution during the fall and the winter, Federalists were forced to respond. And you close out: north of Virginia, they developed four main justifications or excuses for the place of slavery in the Constitution. So I was curious if you could talk about the ratification debates and what that looked like.
I'd love to, because this is my favorite part of the book. It may be the most original part of the book. I love the constitutional debates. They even made me appreciate Madison even more because of how creative he is in them, responding to the Anti-Federalists. I guess I mentioned the Balin's edition of the debates, which I would still recommend, but I want to underline that those are based on this amazing documentary project, the documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution. 25 or so volumes still coming out, in addition to microfilm supplements. This is a project that was started in the late 70s for the bicentennial by Merrill Jensen and some of his students, Gaspar Saladino, Richard Leffler, John Kaminsky at the University of Wisconsin. And what they're doing is publishing everything they could find in manuscript letters, in the press. And what they found was that this was really the birth of American politics, in the sense of a national political debate about something that is of interest to everybody. Now, on the other hand, because ratification is happening state by state, it's also a debate within states that's happening, preparing for these ratifying conventions, happening in the press during the ratification conventions, and then afterwards, the result of the ratification convention, the people in these states are following what's going on in the other states. Articles are being reprinted from elsewhere. It's really like a media event, and a really interesting one. And so just imagine, just imagine today a closed constitutional convention and stuff is leaking out, but not that much of it. And then suddenly it's published and the critics jump on it. Like the people who are suspicious of centralized power, because that's what British history, for a lot of people, British history and the American Revolution has taught people to be critical and suspicious of centralized power. The Anti-Federalists start to say, oh, okay, well, maybe this federal government has too much control over slavery. And the Anti-Federalists, especially in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, pretty early on start to connect the things that they're worried about to the way that the Constitution seems to protect slavery. And they start to say, look, this Constitution is going to make it impossible for us to end slavery. And they start to say other things. They connect the way this government is really not that democratic to what the ways it seems to protect slaveholding interests. They also start to point out that the Constitution explicitly and implicitly guarantees that the federal government will protect the states from domestic insurrections. So that basically means that if you're in Massachusetts, you might be marched south to defend against the slave rebellion. And everybody knows what that means in the wake of previous wars, including the Revolutionary War, in which foreign powers might provoke a slave rebellion. It's not just that, oh well, do you think the slaves are really going to rebel and have a real rebellion? It's not just about that. It's about what when Spain or France invades, or we get involved in some war in this hemisphere and slaves start to take up arms or ally with this other country. Even if we're against this war, we're going to have to serve. So they start to criticize, they start to raise the issue. A couple of the states ratify, but then it all kind of slows down after this very close vote in Massachusetts, where it comes up explicitly in the Constitutional Convention. Madison and Hamilton especially are writing the Federalist Papers, and they start to defend deliberately. Like there's a lot of this stuff in the New York newspapers by some of the leading anti-Federalists, and Madison writes. Especially Federalist 54, but it's there in some of the other Federalist essays, explicitly writing against these arguments in the voice of a Virginian, saying, you have to understand this was a necessary compromise, and it's really not as pro-slavery as it seems, and it's really the best we could do. And he's writing in the voice of a New Yorker, like kind of ventriloquizing a Virginian, and who's kind of like, Virginia is sort of like they're the mediators of all this. They're looking both ways. Virginia is really the upper South at this time. What happens during the ratification debates basically is that the anti-federalists attack, and the federalists say different things to different audiences. To Northerners and in defense of those kinds of anti-slavery, anti-federal arguments, they say, look, we can end the slave trade in 20 years. It's not like the Constitution doesn't explicitly protect slavery, and they say all these things to say that really it's not as pro-slavery as it seems, and these compromises, and compromise is a good thing and it's necessary. Meanwhile, looking the other way, anti-federalist Patrick Henry in Virginia at the Virginia ratifying convention says this federal government is too powerful. They are going to take your slaves away, those Northerners. That's what they really want to do. And James Madison has to rush down there and say, no, that wasn't compromise at all. That's not at all what's going on. We got to look at all these concessions we got. And the same thing happens in South Carolina in their ratifying convention. So basically, the Federalists, who have more of the newspapers in their favor, kind of really spin it well in response to those anti-Federalist, anti-slavery criticisms, but also some pro-slavery anti-Federalist criticisms. And the result is you get this ratification that sets the tone for an ongoing disagreement about what the compromises mean, what the future is going to be, and where the great founding fathers actually stood on this question.
I'm looking at the next question, which includes reference to the Dred Scott decision, which is handed down in 1857, and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And I found myself thinking as you were speaking, okay, 70, 75 years from that point, a little longer, here are two declarations, one a Supreme Court decision and the other decision coming from Congress in the Fugitive Slave Acts, that are a little less ambiguous, perhaps. These are full-throated, and they're perceived as such, full-throated endorsements of slavery. And not only that, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, compelling the North to participate in that. So part of my learning process was learning how important those decisions were and their perception in the North as outrages in hastening, I'll say, not creating the Civil War, but hastening perhaps the arrival of the Civil War. Well, one could look at those decisions and say how atrocious, the worst Supreme Court decision ever, or the worst congressional decision ever. And it might not be too far down the road for then one to say what abnormalities
Yeah.
these must be. But what I want to ask is, looking at how we've discussed the Constitution, are those abnormalities? And then following down that path, to what extent can we say slavery's constitution leads to the Civil War, creates these conditions?
This is a good moment for me to acknowledge and introduce some of the other interpretations of slavery in the Constitution, which uh, I'm in dialogue with, and which have continue to be, in some senses, have been strengthened by subsequent literature. On the one hand, we have Don Fehrenbacher, who first wrote about the Dred Scott case. He argued that the Constitution was a compromise, deliberately ambiguous on slavery, but that the way it was interpreted after 1787, the way history went, made it in effect more pro-slavery over time, culminating in these explicit strengthening of the pro-slavery aspects of the Constitution that you see in Dred Scott and in the Fugitive Slave Act. So that would be the kind of it's 50-50 in 1787, but it's going in the other direction. There's another interpretation that has been most strongly advocated by Sean Wilentz, and which goes back to a split among the abolitionists in the antebellum period, and to some extent supported by my dear colleague James Oakes, that says that there are important that the Constitution really was anti-slavery in a fundamental way, because it didn't say that slaves were property explicitly. And they love to trot out the quote from Madison where he says in his notes, we shouldn't admit in the Constitution that slaves are property, right? Well, Madison does a lot of other things, some of which I've mentioned. This is one thing he says, and we don't even know if he actually said it or whether he just wrote it in his notes later. And on that matter, I strongly recommend a book by Mary Sarah Bilder about Madison's note-taking and rewriting of his notes, and which is called Madison's Hand. But Wilentz thinks that this really is the most important thing and decisive, this no property in man aspect of the Constitution, which ultimately made what enslavers wanted out of the Constitution was like an ironclad guarantee, and that they never got it. And that's why ultimately anti-slavery people are able to use the Constitution, or use the federal government that existed under the Constitution, ultimately to undermine slavery and provoke a civil war. I'm not convinced that this is the right emphasis. I sometimes say that I come out more of instead of 50-50 or 100% anti-slavery, I come out like 75-25. It does matter that it's the silences, and the ambiguities are part of the compromise. The having it both ways that I referred to at the outset. Getting to feel like you're anti-slavery but have your slavery too. These are key aspects of the politics of slavery and of all of politics in the Revolutionary era. And they set up a situation of fundamental disagreement about what the Constitution means, and also a not really knowing what aspects of the Constitution are going to end up being important and decisive. Like, they don't know that the slave trade's not going to be that important yet, right? They think that, if we make it possible to end the slave trade, we're going to make it possible to end slavery. And some people actually argue that in the ratification debates. Madison even hints toward it in various places, though not in Virginia. But then, partly for that reason, it ends up partly because of the cotton boom, partly because of natural reproduction being possible, as it had already turned out to be the case, that they didn't need the international slave trade nearly as much as they did in, say, 1785. When I say they, I mean enslavers. That it doesn't matter as much as even they would think in 1807, 1808. I think so. That's why I put more emphasis on the way that the only reason you get that the Fugitive Slave Acts and Dred Scott are necessary are because of the ambiguities, and because the emancipations that happen in the North, and the fact that people are pushing in both directions, and they're arguing over slavery in new states, and that's being battled out in state constitutions, and it's being battled out in the compromises of 1820 and 1850. So it is absolutely true that the Fugitive Slave Acts and Dred Scott's creates a constitutional crisis and accelerates the road to civil war, and that the Civil War is a constitutional crisis over slavery, really the whole period is a set of constitutional debates where it's all about contest and not about, like, yes, they are, it's precisely because they keep asking, what does the Constitution mean for slavery? And even abolitionists disagree about this, that you end up with this continual struggle that is volatile, that shapes policy, and that seems to go in both directions. It does allow the possibility of abolitionism on a state by state basis, which then drives slaveholders to engage in behaviors and policies that strengthen slavery, which then pisses off anti-slavery people more, which then leads to more compromises. This is the whole story of national politics and federalism. Sometimes we want to telescope it and say, well, it's really because the Constitution was pro-slavery, or it's really because it was anti-slavery, which put South Carolinian property holders in a bind. Those things are partly true, but not completely true. It's because it's both. It's because slavery is such a complicated issue and such unfinished business of the revolution that you end up with this volatile situation that, like, I think that leads to a civil war, and that's actually how I end the book. And Jim Oakes doesn't like when I emphasize that I do think that it could only have been ended by war. But I think John Quincy Adams understood this. What Jim's been really impressed by is how anti-slavery politicians create strategies to force the issue that have to be dealt with, and the way and they are basically undermining slavery, which is why the slaveholders get paranoid and start to do things that then basically oppress Northerners and leave them with not as much power over the future of the nation as they think that they feel they deserve. And that situation leads to the rise of the Republican Party, which is then an existential threat to the slave power. So that then it's that process, basically anti-slavery politics, leads to the Civil War, not the defects of the Constitution. But I think they're really two sides of the same coin. The anti-slavery politics are a response to the Constitution's pro-slavery aspects, not just a kind of continuation of its anti-slavery possibilities.
I want to transition the conversation into slowly bringing us more into the present day, because
Why not?
ultimately, as interesting as the history is, I want to bring it to how it impacts us here. The Civil War and Reconstruction gave us the Reconstruction Amendments that outlawed slavery, overturned Dred Scott, granted birthright citizenship, provided equal protection under the law, all of these incredibly transformative things. And we still have the Senate, which is malapportioned and gives undue influence to small states, no longer slaveholding, but it's malapportioned. Still have the Electoral College, which still gives that undue influence. Still have the Supreme Court, which, without going into a whole history of the Supreme Court, could have perhaps during the civil rights period or around that time have been seen to have been playing a progressive role, or a role different than how it played in the years after Reconstruction, and perhaps different than how it has been playing recently, with explicit attacks or conversations around the 14th Amendment, so on and so forth. So all that to say, and I suppose this also brings us into the territory of how activists or people looking to create political change in the current moment use history and terms to agitate or further an agenda. All that to say, to what extent do we still have a slaver's constitution? Or to what extent does slavery's constitution still exist?
Well, to the extent that the Constitution is very concerned with protecting property and ensuring, perhaps above all, a stable national government, and doing and as Woody Holton has argued so effectively in books like Unruly Americans and the Making Constitution, it is not a democratic document, even though it set up a framework that could be and was more democratized over time. And to that extent, it can be said to be in debt to very much in debt to this history that put the thumb on the scale on behalf of enslavers. And also those particular, the Electoral College and the Senate are not just creations of the need to protect slavery, but that was part of it. And a bigger part of it was protecting different kinds of property, and that from both from what the states might do as well as what individuals might. We have to face that fact, and the it kind of our appreciation of these aspects of the Constitution, the conservative dimensions of the Constitution, as it were, the capitalist dimensions of the Constitution, it kind of waxes and wanes. Like the Constitution seems like the bulwark of our liberties, when things are going in a liberal direction, perhaps, or when things are going well, and or there's relative satisfaction with the economy, and then when there's a lot of discontent, it maybe doesn't. Maybe we're more aware of these other aspects that make it very difficult to change things. On the other hand, the very ambiguities and flexibilities of the Constitution, create resources for using one branch against another, for resuscitating arguments that were actually made at the time, but that may not have been effective or convinced a majority or been ratified by the Supreme Court, but which had considerable plausibility at the time. I think it's one of the reasons why some folks get very nervous with the criticisms of the Constitution that seem to be come out of work like mine, saying that the Constitution was in debt to slavery, is that I think for folks like Sean Wilentz, who is a liberal Democrat, it would seem to undermine the possibilities of using the Constitution to good civic ends, including doing something like saying, look, it's completely unconstitutional the way the president is currently appropriating powers that belong to Congress. If you say that, well, that the Constitution is just empowered slavery and capitalism, and if you focus on that all the time, you miss the fact that it's in the legislative branch that the democratization has happened. It's not just that. Well, yeah, I mean, it helped that FDR was president, and it helped that his administration. Yeah, but FDR couldn't get the New Deal through without Congress. It was having the majorities in Congress that made that possible. If the New Deal is the epitome of progressive and democratic and forward-looking legislation of its time, it wasn't just about what the president decreed. In fact, the things that the president decreed were prevented and overturned, including trying to change the Supreme Court to make it less obstructive and less narrow in terms of interpreting what kinds of governmental policies and agencies were permissible. So right now, this debate we're having over with the Supreme Court, it seems ready to overturn the powers of these agencies that are created by Congress. I mean, that is at the basis a constitutional debate, and we have to argue it in terms. There is no way around arguing it in terms of both precedent since 1787 and what the Constitution says about Congress's powers. And there are reasons to maybe be skeptical about the powers that Congress may have appropriated to create agencies that can act outside of judicial review. But really, that is where it's at, and that's where the debate is. And so at least that's my take on it. And I think we need to also throw in the amendment process, as Jill Lepore has written recently. Why is it so hard to amend the Constitution? And the way that is both an outcome of the accretion of so many states, and the fact that three-fourths of so many states have to ratify it in the way that is relatively undemocratic. But on the other hand, I mean, they passed 10 amendments immediately, and those were an outgrowth. Those are some of our favorite amendments about individual rights, and those were an outgrowth of the contentiousness of the fact that the Constitution was barely ratified. And I actually think, and this is an argument I make that nobody picked up on. So if the ratification of the Constitution was controversial, barely passed in the biggest states, Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York, where the issue of slavery was raised, that means that the objections that all those anti-federalists made, including objections to the pro-slavery aspects of the Constitution, led Madison and others to realize that they needed these amendments that didn't deal much with slavery, but which gave us a much more expansive and rights oriented constitution than existed, including the extremely controversial right to bear arms, which was actually about the right to have a militia, not the right of individuals to bear arms. But just putting that aside, like so much of modern constitutional law is about those first 10 amendments. We could see those as an outcome of the fact that it's not all about what came out of the convention. It's also about what came out of the ratification debates and those first 10 amendments. And if that's the process that enabled this large, diverse federal republic to work out what stuff actually meant and how it should change, the fact that we cannot seem to amend the Constitution is a big problem. And I'm not sure, though, whether to lay that at the feet of slavery's constitution, or say that actually the debates about slavery's constitution were part of what gave the system what flexibility and ability to change that it actually has had. But then, like, the fact remains that you end up with this civil war. So was it flexible? Did it work? I don't know what you can say about a constitution that that needs a civil war in order to have a second founding. I'm not so keen on that whole notion of a second founding, because it implies that the second founding was as revolutionary as a revolution, and that the Constitution was revised, that its revision in the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment was as fundamental as the original Constitution. I think that's only true if you take this kind of like individual rights view of the Constitution that highlights all the amendments. Actually, the most important thing about the Constitution is that it sets up all the rules of government, and that gets neglected. That hasn't changed that much. The amendments did not changed it that much. If we had an amendment if you know what really would have been revolutionary, if it had eliminated the Electoral College. Like if it had changed the rules of taxation or representation, as you rightly pointed out. Actually, it puts us back into that dilemma where there are these unintended effects where, okay, black people are citizens, they have the vote, but you can't prevent them from being prevented from voting. So now actually these southern states have more power ironically, in the New Deal era, they have more power, arguably, than they had when they constituted more of a larger percentage of the states before the Civil War. You get to 1930, and they have these incredible powers because they get the electoral votes for people who aren't being allowed to vote. Not just 3/5 of them, but all of them, as you said. So that would be a real, and that's why and this is also the same reason that amendments are so difficult. So we're still living with the framers' constitution. There was no second founding, except there was a major set of constitutional changes. But I don't know that we should call it a second founding, because that ignores what didn't change, and not just because Reconstruction fails.
Yeah, I share that hesitance to embrace the second founding, second republic language, though I know I hesitate to say very popular, very in vogue these days, or at least I've spoken with many people on the podcast too who've written books or written articles with the title of the second, this, that, or the other. And the comment that I usually put forward is to say Sanford Levinson's ideas of, not his ideas alone, but he uses the phrase hardwired aspects of the Constitution. The Senate, the Electoral College, the unelected Supreme Court. Did those hardwired aspects of the Constitution change? And I think, as you said, it would have been a real second founding or a real change if those aspects had changed, and they didn't.
I'll have to credit Levinson when I say hardwired. It's been a long time since I read. He was a real influence on my work in Slavery's Constitution, but it's been a long time since I read those books. I'll have to go back to see because I've found myself using that phrase. I like to think of the hardwired as kind of literal, like the wiring in a building that you don't see, but which makes the whole building stand and work. It's in the walls, right? When we talk about hardwired, which is an interesting kind of spin on the notion of the older notion of the Constitution as a new roof or the framing, or as they built the house, they built the framework, right? Modern houses require wiring, and maybe the fact of electricity makes us more sensitive to the ways that constitutions actually work. That it's not just like a cover or a container. It's actually determines all the workings of governance in ways that are sometimes invisible, but like all the more powerful for being that. And it is worth conceding that, I mean, Lind used to say that, well, the Civil War is actually the only American Revolution, because what other American Revolution destroyed so much property and freed so many people? And that sounds like a revolution, but that we might think of, just because the Civil War was revolutionary in that sense doesn't mean that it was, maybe it's precisely because the changes weren't sufficiently hardwired in, that there ends up being a backlash, just as the Constitution could be seen as partially a backlash to some of the democratizing aspects of the revolution itself.
Yeah, just to go back to Levinson, I think I first read that term in his 2006 book, the Undemocratic American Constitution, I think it is what it's called, and have been using it since then. I'll mention another person in regards to also the slavery aspect as well. Daniel Lazaire's 1996, I believe, book, The Frozen Republic, uses slavery and the provision saying that I believe it's the importation of slaves can't be changed for 30 years hence. And he puts that
20
in
years.
contrast with the preamble of the Constitution, which doesn't have any legal standing, but people draw on it a lot, saying, well, we the people, X, Y, and Z. You could also take that from the Declaration of Independence as well. But basically to say there are invocations of this idea of the people make the laws, and then, oh, by the way, here's this 30-year ban on changing an aspect of the law, just to draw out a contradiction. You've talked in this conversation about how other historians have talked about slavery in the Constitution. I was surprised, perhaps naively, I don't know, to read, if it's a hard copy on the dust jacket of your book, or if it's a soft copy on the back, that you've written the first book to recognize slavery's place at the heart of the U.S. Constitution in this book. Has the narrative around slavery and the Constitution changed since you've written this book in 2009, and maybe even post Trump, if that's the right way to put it, in which perhaps in general people are questioning a sort of progression towards rights and freedoms, perhaps questioning the Constitution, and in other ways wanting to grasp it even tighter. Wanted to turn that over to you.
Yeah, at a certain point in the 2000 teens, it became kind of I was surprised. I wasn't expecting this, but it became kind of like more polarized, where you had uh, it was no longer the originalists defending the Constitution, saying the compromises were necessary and were eventually vindicated, and versus the debunkers. And I thought I was doing something that was to some extent mediating and broadening the conversation. So I was surprised to see it become a kind of like the old debate about whether the Constitution was anti-slavery or pro-slavery really get kind of heated and even some would say nasty. And not just in the left versus right way. I mean, among the people on the left side of the spectrum where Willents and Gordon Wood took issue with increasingly publicly, because it wasn't just me writing this book, which was easy enough to ignore, took issue with the whole notion of describing the founders as pro-slavery. And it became bigger even than the specific issue of the Constitution. It became about the whole revolution and the founding and the founders. And so it's still kind of in that place where it's very heated, and it seems like the implications only get larger. And some historians kind of feel like, well, this is sort of pointless and will never get resolved, and which is kind of understandable, because I mean, how can it be resolved when nobody? I mean, it's been debated for 200 years, and people who had a lot invested in it, including the abolitionists, couldn't really resolve it. And it was really determined as much by what people felt the political implications were at the time they were arguing, as by a kind of sober look at the documents. I mean, a kind of great example is when Lincoln goes to the Illinois State Library to do research and looks at Madison's notes and says, "Oh, look, like the founders look like, you can look at he looks at the debates and says, well, like, look, they're like Madison and others are being defensive, and some of them are saying, well, like, we can only do these things, but we expect that slavery will end eventually." So Lincoln comes out of that by saying the founders wanted to end slavery, and we have to do everything we can under the Constitution to help it along that way, right? I mean, he's like a strict constitutionalist, but saying like there's wiggle room here, and the founders are anti-slavery. Willents wants to say, well, look, Lincoln was right. The Republicans were right, or that's the implication of a lot of the work we're doing. And I want to say, like, no, it's a lot more complicated than that. He was making a political argument. He was making it, he was trying to do it with evidence and with real, but so do both originalists and people who have a more evolutionary or progressive approach to the Constitution. The notion that the Constitution changes over time, how it's been interpreted or has changed over time, those precedents matter. History changes, so how we understand those words has to change, and always does change, even if we think we're not changing it. For political reasons, I think we're always looking for simpler answers, and then really the historical evidence will allow. And that's why I thought it was worthy of a book, and one that was hopefully both complex but also short enough that people would actually read it and pay close attention to it. It's like an accordion, right? You have Michael Klarman doing the 800-page version, and you have me do it. He's doing a lot more. He's doing the whole coming of the Constitution, but coming out in a place that I think is very similar to where I do. And you have everything in between. So I do think that I think some people because it became actually a more of a public debate, and I guess I refer folks to like some things I've written in the Boston Review, and even before that, this back and forth I had with the Willents after he had not been in the New York Times, and I replied with a piece in the Atlantic about how the Constitution actually was pro-slavery, and that's become a kind of a like soundbite version of the debate that I think that some high school teachers have told me they have found quite useful for introducing the whole history. But really, that came out of Bernie Sanders went to Liberty University, and like he knew where he was, and he said, look, we have to deal with the fact that the founders wrote slavery into the Constitution. So we can't be this worshipful about the Constitution. You got to choose. You can't have it both ways. You can't be anti-slavery or for progress and say that the framers of the Constitution had all the answers. And, he threw down the gauntlet in this speech. And that went too far for Willents at the time, maybe because he was supporting Hillary Clinton and not Sanders in the Democratic primaries at that time. So he wrote this piece, and he was right. I guess he was working on he was starting to work on the topic at the time, say that no, the Constitution really was anti-slavery. So it really is the debate is kind of hard to separate from appeals to the founding, which at least until Trump were basic to American politics. The real break, arguably, is the fact that Trump thinks the Constitution is whatever he says it is, and we are in a post-originalist moment. Whatever Justice Roberts and Thomas and Alito think, we're in a post-originalist moment. And their own actions are like telegraphing it, because they're getting further and further away from actually attending to the actual text and history of the Constitution, even though they say that's what they're basing their decisions on. And they're doing it because the president is putting all this pressure on them to throw it out the window and say that it's all about executive discretion. So they may be in a tough place interpretively, but it's a place where some of them clearly wanted to go, and they know that very well. And that's why these justices were appointed. They were appointed because they had been the most extreme on the issue of executive power. That's Roberts, that's Kavanaugh, to some extent Barrett, though not quite as much.
The last thing I wanted to ask you before we close out is if your ideas or opinions about the Constitution changed over the course of writing and researching this book, or have changed since writing this book. It sounds like you came into the process with a pretty clear idea of what you wanted to write. As you said, a short, readable book about this issue that you didn't feel like was getting enough attention. But if you encountered any change during that process.
I came into it feeling like the story that anti-slavery constitutionalism was known about and pro-slavery constitution was known about, but how it actually all played out and got created wasn't really understood. I do think that the greater attention to how anti-slavery constitutionalism responded to the story I'm telling is really important, and has informed how I approach talking about it and how I approach the longer story. So to some extent, I think that the criticism and opposition that I've gotten from folks like Willents and to some extent conversations with Jim Oakes has sharpened my sense of the longer story and the importance of understanding anti-slavery politics over the long haul, and the good work that's been done on that. But I guess I have to confess that I'm still, and this conversation ratifies that that I'm kind of still sticking to my guns about the importance of understanding the complications and the importance of understanding the silences and the ambiguities, and really the dialectic between constitutionalism and the rest of politics. The importance of not like sort of separating that out and saying, well, there are moments of constitutional crisis, and then you get back to normal politics, as opposed to seeing all of American politics as happening within these constitutional limits that are sometimes the fence gets jumped, and then and sometimes things happen that aren't supposed to happen, and that nobody would have predicted based on a lot of history, a lot of political behavior. But it is still really important to realize this paradox that we have a constitution that has lasted longer than any other constitution, and yet has always been broken in the sense of like not of like being like set up to fail, and did fail in the Civil War. I mean, what can you say about a constitution that can't be resolved without a civil war that kills that many people? The idea of a series of republics, like, okay, if it's a whole new republic, then it's not the same constitution, but it is the same constitution revised. So we could either emphasize the brilliance of the revisions and the ironies of them, or we could say, it's never quite worked the way it's supposed to work, and it's still, we need to pay attention to the ways in which it's not working always, and that's always been the case. I guess it has doing the project has really made me kind of convinced me that we all need to pay more attention to the history, to the role of the Constitution in our politics, and a little frustrated that it's a lot easier to tell American history as a succession of presidents or parties, or the dominance of New Deal era, the Democrats are in charge, the Cold War, the Republicans are in charge, the Reagan era, the Reagan Revolution, and not pay attention to the ways in which the Constitution has shaped and been shaped by those party systems, as they used to be called, or those the rise and fall of particular presidents and their successors. If it gets too detached from the constitutional story, we're really missing uh, why things do and don't change.
Well, David, I really appreciate you coming on and talking with us about your book, U.S. history, the Constitution, the present moment. It's been really great, and I'm sure listeners not only understand these topics more, but also have various threads to pick up on and perhaps a longer reading list of articles and books. So really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks. It's these issues go on, and it's really fun to think again and expand on them.